Hello and welcome to Voices from the Left. I'm your host, Kraig. Thanks for listening. We are a presentation of the Anti-Capitalist Podcast Network, and I'm joined tonight by my comrade Jordon, who's one of the hosts of 805 Uncensored podcast, and he'll be presenting a biography about Peter Kropotkin. Hi, Jordon. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, good to be here, Greg.
Yeah, this is gonna be great. So we're following up. Earlier this year, you did a biography of Emma Goldman for us,
hmm
which was great. And now you're here to do another one for us about Peter Kropotkin. So without further ado or preamble, I'll let you get rolling.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on, man. So, Kropotkin, on top of Emma Goldman, are basically my two major intellectual heroes. So, it's an honor to do this. I'd like
Oh
to
yeah.
just first start off with a quote from Kropotkin. Just really encapsulates his views on the world. Everywhere you will find that the wealth of the wealthy springs from the poverty of the poor. Meaning, of course, that the rich are only able to become rich because of the poverty of the poor.
Right on.
Kropotkin lived from 1842 until 1921. He was a Russian zoologist, writer, author, geographer, and anarchist. He's widely considered the founder of the school of thought known as anarcho-communism. He was born December 9th, 1842, which is another reason I wanted to do this episode because we're just celebrating his birthday. He was born in Moscow into an aristocratic family, and he was actually a prince. But by the time that he was 12, he had become so radicalized by his experience in the aristocracy, he rejected the notion of being a prince, hated the label. Anytime his friends would call him prince, he would shut them down. And he didn't want anything a part of that. Just, he was born into it and he wanted to distance himself as much as possible. He attended this school called Page Corps, which was a military academy in Imperial Russia. At Page Court, he studied animal life, geographic exploration, and on the basis of his observations, he elaborated a theory of the structural lines of mountain ranges that revised the cartography of Eastern Asia. So I thought that was pretty interesting.
Wow. Yeah, that's sweet.
His experiences in Siberia also inspired knowledge of the glaciation of Asia and Europe during the Ice Age. So he wasn't just an anarchist, he wasn't just a philosopher. He actually had legitimate scientific findings that were used by other scientists to learn more about the natural world.
That's cool. It makes sense, I guess. If he's a zoologist, he'd have some knowledge and or curiosity about that stuff, right?
Right. And then in his book, which I'll touch more on later, Mutual Aid, A Factor in Evolution, he's talking about anarchism deriving from evolutionary biology and how it was made possible by mutual aid and cooperation. So he later serves as an officer in Siberia, where he embarks on several geographic expeditions. And he was actually imprisoned in 1874, managed to escape 2 years later. This was an epic escape, and he
Sweet.
became a legend throughout Europe after this. His radical ideas started spreading rapidly, and he was revered in anarchist circles throughout Europe.
Do you know?
So,
Sorry, do you know what he was imprisoned for?
some sort of just bullshit trumped up charges with the cops,
Gotcha. Okay.
passing out pamphlets,
Yeah.
organizing, doing shit like that.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
kind of being a
Something
nuisance. Yeah,
against the
just being a
government,
general
I'm sure.
nuisance to the ruling class and elite.
Nice. Nice.
So yeah, he would later spend the next 40 years in exile in Switzerland, France, where he was imprisoned again for nearly 4 years, and England. And while in exile, he continued to give lectures and provided pamphlets about anarchism, geography, and a few other subjects that he had learned about when he was in school. And I thought this was interesting too. Drawing on his own experience of prison life, he advocated a thorough modification of the penal system. Prisons, he said, were schools of crime that, far from reforming the offender, subjected him to brutalizing punishments and hardened him in criminal ways. In the future anarchist world, antisocial behavior would be dealt with not by laws and prisons, but by human understanding and the moral pressure of the community. He wrote Specifically on anarchism, anarchism is the name given to a principle or theory of life and conduct under which society is conceived without government harmony, in such a society being obtained not by submission to law or by obedience to any authority, but by free agreement concluded between various groups, territorial and professional, freely constituted for the sake of consumption, as also for the satisfaction of the infinite variety needs and aspirations of a civilized being. And then also at this time, he wrote, "Must we occupy ourselves with an examination of the ideal of a future system, an anarchist analysis of a post-revolutionary order in which decentralized cooperative organizations would take over the functions that were normally performed by governments." So undoubtedly, Kropotkin's main goal, and he often referenced this himself, was to deliver anarchism with a scientific basis, going back to his beliefs about evolutionary biology. His ideas of mutual aid and cooperation were directly opposed to the philosophical concept known as social Darwinism, which emphasized competition and survival of the fittest. Kropotkin argued instead that evolutionary biology was dependent upon cooperation in a system of mutual aid within species. He traced the evolution of voluntary cooperation from the primitive tribe, peasant village, and medieval commune to a variety of modern associations, trade unions, learned societies, and the Red Cross, that have continued to practice mutual support despite the rise of the coercive, bureaucratic state. The trend of modern history, he believed, was pointing back towards decentralized, non-political, cooperative societies in which people could develop their creative facilities without interference from rulers, clerics, or soldiers. And he's perhaps best known as his contributions towards anarchist communism, which I kind of said in the beginning. And his foundational text for this is called The Conquest of Bread, also known as the Bread Book. He lays out his vision of anarchist communism here, what it would look like in a society, how to get there. And also, he points out the objections that you would potentially run into laying out this argument. He says, "No more of such vague formula as the right to work, or to each the whole result of his labor, while we proclaim is the right to well-being, well-being for all." So what he's saying there is it's bullshit to say you have a right to a job. No, you have a right to be free because you were born free.
Makes sense.
He further contends that the central obstacle preventing humanity from claiming this right is the state's violent protection of private property. Kropotkin compares this relationship to feudalism, saying that even if the forms have changed, the essential relationship between the proprietary and the landless is the same as the relationship between feudal lords and their serfs. Kropotkin calls for the destruction of the state and the expropriation of all property into the commons, where the right to well-being can be achieved for all people. So, in order to prepare people for this happier lifestyle, he pinned his hopes on the education of the young, which I thought was really interesting because I feel like this is something that we frequently talk about on the podcast and just in our kind of general leftist circles, is the value of education and its role in radicalization and revolution in general. So he called for education that would cultivate both mental and manual skills. Due emphasis was to be placed on the humanities and on mathematics and science, but instead of being taught from books, children were to receive an active outdoor education and to learn by doing and observing firsthand, a recommendation that has been widely endorsed by modern educational theorists. Kropotkin combined the qualities of a scientist and moralist with those of a revolutionary organizer and propagandist. For all his mild benevolence, he condoned the use of violence in the struggle for freedom and equality, and during his early years as an anarchist militant, he was among the most vigorous exponents of propaganda by the deed, acts of insurrection that would supplement oral and written propaganda and help to awaken the rebellious instincts of the people. He was the principal founder of both the English and Russian anarchist movements and exerted a strong influence on the movements in France, Belgium, and Switzerland. But ultimately, he alienated many of his comrades by supporting the Allied powers during World War I. So they didn't like his support of militarism during World War I, but from his perspective, he believed that it was necessary because he thought that German authoritarianism might prove fatal to social progress in general.
Weird.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he called that 20 years beforehand. violated the strong anti-militarist tradition among anarchists and touched off bitter polemics that nearly destroyed the movement for which he had labored nearly half a century. So yeah, the fact that like the left destroying itself, like that's not at all a new phenomenon.
No, it's
It's
been going on
literally
forever.
it's existed
Yeah.
since the beginning of anarchism.
Yeah.
And
No
this is
shit.
just like when anarchism is being formally recognized. Anarchism, of course, existed centuries before this,
Sure.
but like specifically, we're talking about anarchist communism here. And
Yeah.
so I thought it was quite, um, I thought it was pretty interesting that
No kidding.
he was willing to take that position, a pro-militarist position,
Yeah.
but then kind of formulate it into a leftist argument for the sake of social progress.
Right. Well, it's especially interesting since um like to take that stance, like to me that brings into the fold like the difference between, not difference I shouldn't say, but like that's the anarchist part of anarcho-communism, right? Not all of it, but like one part, right? Because Lenin talks about imperialism constantly, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of people predicted the World War One was going to happen like in the late 1800s, and because of imperialism, and that it was going to be bad when it happened, so that basically you needed to have some kind of anti-imperialist state in place to kind of control things.
Yeah, exactly. And I thought it was really interesting that he saw the writing on the wall, essentially, for Nazi
Yep,
Germany.
totally, 100%. Yeah.
So we go to the Russian Revolution now. Kropotkin's return to Russia and the Russian Revolution. So, because of the Russian Revolution in 1917, the conditions that existed made it possible that Kropotkin was able to return to Russia after being exiled. So events took an unexpected turn with the outbreak of the Russian Revolution in 1917. Kropotkin by this time was age 74, so he was old during the Russian Revolution. Hastened to return to his homeland because, again, he's been away from Russia for almost 50 years. When he arrives in Petrograd, which is now known as St. Petersburg, in June 1917, after 40 years in exile, he's greeted warmly and offered the Ministry of Education in the provisional government, a post he declined, yet his hopes for the future were never brighter, because in 1917, the organizations that he thought might form the basis of a stateless society, the communes and Soviets, where soldiers and workers' councils, suddenly began to appear in Moscow and St. Petersburg. So
So
what he had written about, what he had dreamed about for decades, he was seeing in practice happen right there in his home country.
yeah, interesting. So what did he get offered that position before October of 17, like in that transitional government
Yes,
before Lenin?
this is June of 1917.
Okay, gotcha.
So after the Bolshevik seizure of power in the October Revolution in 1917, his earlier enthusiasm turned to bitter disappointment. "This buries the revolution," he remarked to a friend. "The Bolsheviks," he said, "have shown how the revolution was not to be made, that is, by authoritarian rather than libertarian methods." Kropotkin's last years were devoted chiefly to writing a history of ethics, one volume in which was completed. He also fostered an anarchist cooperative in the village of Dmitrov, north of Moscow, where he died in 1921. His funeral was attended by tens of thousands of admirers, was the last occasion in the Soviet era when the black bloc of anarchism was paraded through the Russian capital. And his life was exemplified by the high ethical standard and the combination of thought and action that he preached throughout his writings. He displayed none of the egotism, duplicity, or lust for power that marred the image of so many other revolutionaries. Because of this, he was admired not only by his own comrades, but by many for whom the label of anarchist meant little more than the dagger and the bomb. The French writer Roman Roland said that Kropotkin lived what Leo Tolstoy only advocated, and Oscar Wilde called him one of the two really happy men he had known. Any thoughts on that passage?
Yeah, I don't know a whole lot about Oscar Wilde, but that seems interesting that they even cross paths, I guess. I just don't know their history. So, because Oscar Wilde was American, right?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
Oscar Wilde is known as a legitimate anarchist, somebody
Yeah.
that was one of the classical anarchists that definitely followed the influence of Kropotkin. So
Sure.
the
Interesting.
fact that he kind of made that connection, yeah, I thought was
Yeah.
fascinating.
Yeah. I have one other question, sort of from something you talked about earlier, but um, do you think uh, Kropotkin was involved in like the Paris Commune or any of those that happened after like Engels and Marx released the Communist Manifesto? Because
I'm
he was
thinking,
outside of Russia at that point, right?
yes, and he was actually he was imprisoned in France for almost 4 years.
That's where he was in prison. Okay,
Yes, after he was in exile, yeah, he got
gotcha.
re-imprisoned in France.
Jeez. Okay.
Because yeah, so I definitely think that he had something to do with the Paris Commune. I'm sure that he
He was
influenced.
around those circles, I'm sure.
Yes,
Yeah.
and he was highly influential.
Interesting. That's pretty great.
And then even decades later, um, which I'll touch on actually right now, he remained highly
Sure.
influential because of his impact on the Spanish Civil War. The conquest of bread served as a foundational text for the anarchist militias that resisted the fascist movement in Spain at the time during the Civil War in the 1930s.
Gotcha.
Um, and then his impact in general has inspired anarchist history, praxis, and theory for generations following him. He wrote on anarchy here. I think this is just a fabulous quote. With anarchy as an aim and as a means, communism becomes possible. Without it, the necessary becomes slavery and cannot exist. And then just he wrote that in Peter Kropotkin's Communism and Anarchy from 1901.
Hmm.
I I also just wanted to kind of add on to that because if you read The Conquest of Bread, I want to say it's chapter 3. It says communism leads to anarchy and anarchy leads to communism. And I think about that all the time because of all the like this leftist infighting, and it it just makes so much sense, right?
Yeah.
You can't
Yep.
have one without the other.
I think you kind of do have both at some point, right?
Yes, and that's where Marx and Kropotkin would have agreed. Where they wouldn't have agreed is the transitionary state.
Yeah, because that was the big thing. And Lenin too was like, you'll still have government before it withers away, right? After the proletariat, after you have you have the dictatorship of the proletariat after you overthrow the bourgeoisie,
Right,
and
because we're talking
then
about socialism now. We're
right,
talking
yep,
about the transitionary stage between capitalism and communism.
yep, and they what like Kropotkin, I don't know this, but I'm guessing he was just like, no, we just get rid of the state altogether right away after the revolution. And Marx and Lenin are like, no, there's going to naturally still be a state, but it will wither away eventually because once you get everything in line and get the workers' councils set up and all of that, then eventually you just don't have a need for the state because everybody is in line, which that's probably there's probably some naivete there, but I think that's the main difference, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It was, abolish capitalism, have a revolution, and then we have communism. Because Kropotkin's biggest thing, and really any anarchist, myself included, is we're terrified of the so-called red bureaucracy. We're worried about a transitionary authoritarian state.
Yeah. Which in some cases I think you have. Generally it's authoritarian towards the bourgeoisie and like the petty bourgeoisie, right? So they can be totally
Right.
removed from power. And authoritarian's probably the only way to do that, unfortunately. And
Yeah,
but
as long as the workers and the poor don't get crushed in the process.
yeah, I mean, I think in practice it doesn't necessarily work that way. But in from what my understanding is, what Marx and Lenin thought was going to happen was like you get the workers' councils and you have the proletariat are armed. They'll be the ones dealing with it. You don't have an official police governed by the state, run by the state. You don't have a military run by the state. You just have the entire proletariat is armed, right? And they disarm the bourgeoisie and the bourgeoisie institutions, right? And then they run it until it eventually withers away naturally, which, like I said, there's probably some naivete there about how that functions, but that's the general idea from my limited understanding of what I've read.
Yeah, and that's really like just what comes down to the basic disagreement between Marxists and anarchists, and why really it's so silly that we
It
can't
is.
just
Yeah.
work together.
Yeah,
Because
totally. Yeah.
while it is a major difference, and it's, I'm not understating how important it is, in the grand scheme of things, we can fucking work together.
100%. Yeah. Yeah. And you and I have talked about this probably ad nauseum, but in the end, it doesn't really matter, right? What if, let's say, we'll take North America for example. It doesn't matter what white people want, right?
Yeah.
It matters to turn the governance of the land and the land back to the indigenous, and they'll decide how they govern. If they want to do actual Marxism, they'll do actual Marxism. If they want to do something else, they'll do that. And from other things I've read, most of what, I shouldn't say most, but a lot of what Marx wrote about, he got those ideas from anthropologists that went to North America and wrote about the indigenous in North America and how their societies functioned. Right. So it's not like they were, the indigenous were already doing communism, quote unquote. Right. Yeah. Because that's just how their societies functioned without calling it communism. I mean, I know I'm oversimplifying it, but like that was part of where Marx got his idea from.
Right. There's no private property. There's no state. There's
right.
There's no social classes. There's
right. Yeah. There's nothing.
Yeah, and it's really awesome that you say that, actually, Kraig, because I'm actually about to post this episode that we just did on MAGA communism and patriotic socialism.
Yeah, Pat socks.
And
oh boy.
Yeah, and really what we're talking about is red fascism, and not just that, but we're talking about these people that want to use communist and socialistic aesthetics. And think about this concept, Kraig. They reject decolonization.
Yeah, well, of course they do, because they're nationalists.
They reject land back as the principal contradiction. So how can you be a communist? How can you be a socialist?
Right. That's why they're full of shit.
Yeah, they're just social chauvinists.
Yeah, that's exactly what they are. Yeah, no, they're horseshit. Fucking white supremacists, basically.
Yeah. So and then my last thing that I wanted to just talk about Kropotkin is some of the notable works that he has. Just going through his list of books. 1885, he writes Words of a Rebel. 1887, he writes In Russian and French Prisons. 1892, the legendary The Conquest of Bread. 1896, I just heard about this one the other day. I need to listen to this. Shout out the Audible Anarchist for your listeners. Free content on YouTube.
Nice.
Amazing audio quality. You'll learn all about anarchism. So 1896, the state and its historic role. 1897, he writes Anarchist Morality. 1898, Fields, Factories, and Workshops. 1899, Memoirs of a Revolutionist. 1902, another foundational text, Mutual Aid, A Factor of Evolution. 1903, Modern Science and Anarchism. 1909, The Terror in Russia, which another thing I find fascinating. He sees the authoritarianism in Russia 8 years before the revolution. And, of course, he's talking about the fallout of Tsar Nicholas II, but he's also predicting the future and seeing where Russia could go.
Right. Well,
so I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah. Well, and I would think he'd probably read Lenin.
Oh yeah.
Right.
I would think he had one of the strongest critiques of Lenin. And he fully supported the Russian Revolution until he really saw what it turned into.
Yeah.
I could actually pull it up and send it to you later on.
Sure.
But yeah, he had a really strong critique of Lenin, which you don't hear about too often, really.
Yeah.
So then he writes in 1915, Ideals and Realities in Russian Literature. And 1924, Ethics, Origin, and Development, which I just think it's really awesome to see somebody that's an anarchist and using a scientific application to their philosophy.
100%. Is there any, so Engels wrote uh socialism, scientific and utopian, right? Does Kropotkin or any anarchist have a thing like that applies, like that lays out in text format, like a scientific anarchist, so to speak, view?
I would say mutual aid, a factor in evolution.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay.
But it is political, but it's not like explicitly political as Engels would have written,
Sure.
socialist scientists and the utopian.
Yeah. Well, and it's, I mean, everything's political when you get down to it, right? Like from
Yes,
from cutting, from how often
but
you're
not
supposed to cut your grass.
explicitly
Yeah.
political.
From how often you're supposed to cut your grass if you own your house, right?
Yeah.
To voting for president. Right? Like, yeah, unfortunately that's just the world we live in. It's hidden, I think, from people. I shouldn't say hidden. It's there in plain sight. People just don't realize it, that everything actually is political. But anyway, I digress.
I know.
That's another conversation.
We should also mention that we're drinking White Russians
Oh yeah.
in
Yeah.
celebration of Kropotkin.
Right. Yes. White Russians. Yeah. Oh yeah. Um Interesting. So what
One other thing.
yeah, go ahead.
I'll just make this real quick, Kraig. Sorry.
Yeah, no worries.
I also found out he had a legendary argument with Emma Goldman about the
Okay.
issue of sex. So he
Gotcha.
traveled to America and he met with Emma Goldman, and they discussed that on the covers of mass media, they're constantly talking about sex, and Kropotkin didn't like that. He's an old man, so
Yeah.
he's a bit of a moralist,
Oh,
boomer
fuddy duddy.
mentality.
Yeah.
Yeah, Goldman's much younger than him. She's obviously a woman. Different take on this. She's like, well, it might not mean a lot to you, but to me and to millions of other young people, it means a great deal. And the reason this is important is because he actually had a highly sexist take towards her.
Mm.
He said that women would become equal to men once they approached them intellectually. So she shut down this entire she shut down this entire fucking argument.
Awesome.
With that one thing, and then he took a second, he looked at her, and he was basically like, you know what? You're right.
I'm an asshole.
He supposedly had this twinkle in his eye, which was indicative of him thinking about his younger years and how he knew that she was completely right because he was reflecting on his own sex life.
Sure.
And this is another really interesting thing is Emma Goldman wrote a lot about her sex life, and Kropotkin really didn't. And so this is one of the divisions between them, but the fact that they were able to meet and have this argument, and also the fact that he was such a fierce debater, he was known as being extremely argumentative.
Okay.
The fact that she won the argument, and such a personal argument at that, really resonated with her and him.
Sure.
And it kind of just like solidified their relationship for the rest of his life.
Interesting. So what else is there to say, I guess, about like Kropotkin's background? Like, was he like, do you know much about his parents? Was he in a relationship? Did he have kids or anything like that?
I didn't read anything about him getting married or having children.
Okay.
I just know that he was born into a wealthy family in Russia.
Gotcha.
And just growing up as a child, he didn't resonate with the rich and really wanted to isolate himself as much as possible from that. Gotcha. And he even went as far as saying, like, I need to do something with my life. He didn't want to be somebody that just inherited wealth. Sure. So that's why he went off to Siberia and explored things and became a scientist and wanted to study animals, because he felt that was his true calling. He felt that was his contribution to the world. Do
you know, you said he was a prince. This was in Russia, right? Do you know which I don't know Russian history. Do you know who his parents were? Like what family he was in?
Um, I
Like, is
don't.
there a continuous line like there is in England where you can trace back the family for, 1,000 years or whatever?
So he came from the Salima family, which is a
Okay.
descendant of I'm sure I'm going to be saying this wrong, Zaporozhian Cossacks leader, and he
Okay.
was the youngest of her four children.
Gotcha.
And he was only 3 years old when his mother died of tuberculosis,
Okay.
and his father ended up remarrying 2 years later.
Gotcha.
But it's
All
a
right.
it's essentially an ancient Russian noble family of the Rurik stock, descending from Prince Dmitry Vasilevich, nicknamed Kropotka.
Gotcha. So Nicholas was the one overthrown in right in the early 1900s. Was he part of that family or was that a different family?
Nicholas was part of the Romanovs.
Okay.
Yeah, they were famously assassinated. The entire family was murdered in 1917 ahead of the revolution.
Right. Yeah, that was where that transitional period was, right?
Yeah, Tsar Nicholas II, the Romanov family of Russia.
Gotcha. All
But
right.
it also just it's relevant to the news right now, right? Because this guy Luigi, he was also an example of a class traitor,
Yeah.
but reverse, right?
Yeah.
Somebody, and just like Kropotkin, somebody that comes from wealth that decides this is not for me,
Yeah. Fuck
gets
this.
gets
Yeah.
extremely radicalized,
Interesting.
and it I don't know, it gives me hope for the future, and also just
Yeah.
I think it's cool too seeing that there's a consistent showing of class traders in opposite directions throughout history.
Right. Well, and I think I'm just making this up. I have no idea if what I'm saying makes any sense, but like Kropotkin, because he was believed in mutual aid and like that is inherently like leftist and against the capitalist class, right? Or it wasn't probably the capitalist class in
Yeah.
Russia. It was the czars and shit. But like
Hmm.
essentially the same thing, right? Against the capitalist class, the ruling class, right? I kind
Yes.
of use those terms synonymously, but like he would have naturally been against it just by having the philosophy of mutual aid, right? Because that goes against, collectivism is the opposite of of individualism, right? And
Right.
especially with capitalism, it's hardwired into people,
Right. And
right?
another thing that I also just wanted to emphasize for you and the listeners, Kraig, is um, he became an anarchist through his visits to Siberia, through his
Mm,
work as a zoologist, exploring and studying animals in the
okay,
natural world, studying evolution. That's how he became an anarchist.
gotcha,
It wasn't like he was already a leftist and then just wanted to venture out into the woods.
gotcha. He took his lived experience observing animals in the wild.
Yes, and then developing a theory based on Darwin that
Gotcha.
mutual aid and social cooperation between species is what led to biology, or
Mm,
sorry, is what led to evolution, I should say.
sure, sure. Okay, interesting. Yeah, that's I like that.
But yeah, that's pretty much it, man.
Yeah, sweet. No, that's good, man. I appreciate that. Um, thought I was going to say something else. Excuse me.
So
Um, go
Kropotkin
ahead.
also comes from the Rurik dynasty. It was founded in the 15th century, so he came from a long time noble family in Russia.
Okay, gotcha. All right. All right. Okay. Well, hey, man, this has been great. Thank you for putting this on, for doing the work to put this together. I always appreciate learning. Um, so yeah, I hope the listeners do too. Um, and just a heads up to everybody, we're trying something new here. I'm going to post the video on my YouTube channel. We'll see how it goes. I don't know how the editing's going to go, but if anyone makes it this far to the end, yeah, it was my first attempt at a second attempt, I guess, because I posted that video on the Anti-Cap YouTube channel of you and I and Heather discussing climate change and intersectionality.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's another fun topic. Anyway, yeah, so thank you, man. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime. I'm always happy to come on your show. It's always an awesome time, man.
For sure. That does it for the show. Thanks for listening. Voices from the Left is a presentation of the Anti-Capitalist Podcast Network. Special thanks to Nick Josephs for the use of the theme song. You can find Nick on Spotify or on the web at nickjosephs.com. Don't forget to rate and review on whichever platform you listen. If you'd like to support the show, you can subscribe at patreon.com/voicesfromtheleft or donate at buymeacoffee.com/voicesfromtheleft. All the links will be in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and solidarity.